A cold wind blew through the empty streets as a mother held her daughter's tiny hand. Their breath made little clouds in the freezing night air. They had no home, no food, and no place to go. Victoria Carter had spent months trying to survive, keeping her little girl, Clara, safe from a world that had only been cruel to them. But tonight, the cold was too strong, and Victoria knew they would not make it until morning. Then, far away, she saw a huge house with bright golden lights shining in the dark. It looked warm and safe. She had no other choice. With shaking hands, she knocked on the big wooden doors, hoping someone inside would help them. But what she didn't know was that behind those doors was a past she thought was gone forever, and a truth that would change everything. The cold bit at Victoria's skin long before the sun rose. The night had been harsh, like every winter night. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground. She moved a little, careful not to wake Clara, who was curled up beside her under their only blanket. The little girl breathed softly, her small fingers holding onto Victoria's coat, even while she slept. Even though Victoria was so tired, a mother's love was stronger. She gently pulled the blanket tighter around Clara, as if it could keep her safe from the cruel world. Victoria's stomach was empty, the hunger a sharp pain she had learned to ignore. She had to stay strong. The morning had come, and they had to survive. She took a deep breath, rubbing warmth into her frozen hands, and got ready to wake her daughter. "Sweetheart," she whispered, brushing messy strands of hair from Clara's pale face. Clara made a soft sound and slowly opened her sleepy eyes. She looked at her mother, confused. "It's time to get up, my love," Victoria said gently. She had to hurry. The streets were not safe for people like them. Victoria helped Clara sit up, rubbing her arms to warm her. The child winced, her fingers stiff from the cold. Victoria felt anger rise inside her, but she swallowed it. No child should wake up like this, shivering, hungry, and facing another day with nothing. "We'll find something to eat," Victoria promised. But she didn't know how. She made promises all the time. They cost nothing, but they were all she had left to give Clara. Clara nodded without question, trusting her mother completely. That trust was Victoria's greatest joy, but also her biggest fear. How long before Clara realized her mother's promises were empty? How long before she understood that everything will be okay was just something Victoria said to keep them both from falling apart? They walked down the alley, their steps careful on the slippery, frozen pavement. The city was waking up, and Victoria knew they had to move before the streets became crowded. She led Clara to the back of a small bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air. It was a cruel reminder of what they didn't have. Victoria had learned how shop owners acted. Some threw away good food near the dumpsters. Others chased her away before she could even ask. Today was a bad day. A worker stepped outside with a trash bag. He saw Victoria, frowned, and shook his head before she could even speak. "Nothing today," he muttered and slammed the door shut. Clara's stomach made a loud, hungry noise. Victoria clenched her fists, pushing down her frustration. "Let's keep moving," she said, guiding Clara away. There was no point in begging when there was no kindness. They walked to another street, one with small cafes and food carts. The air smelled like roasted coffee and buttered pastries. Clara's eyes stayed on a tray of golden croissants in a shop window. She squeezed Victoria's hand tighter. Victoria wanted to tell her to look away, but she couldn't. A man in a suit walked past them and threw half a bagel into a trash can like it was nothing. Victoria hesitated for only a second before walking toward the bin. She had learned that dignity didn't feed her child. Digging through trash was a small price to pay for food. "Stay here," she told Clara softly. She reached into the can. The bagel was still warm. It had barely touched the dirty paper cups and napkins at the bottom. A small victory. She wiped it on her sleeve and turned back to Clara, breaking the bagel in half. "Here, sweetheart," she said, giving the bigger piece to Clara. Clara looked at her mother, then at the food. You need it too, Mommy. Victoria smiled, or at least tried to. I'm fine, baby. Eat up. Clara ate slowly, making each bite last. Victoria pretended not to see when her daughter tried to give her a small piece. You're so kind, my love, Victoria whispered, running a hand through Clara's messy curls. But I need you to be strong, okay? Clara nodded, chewing quietly. Moments like these broke Victoria more than hunger or cold. Her little girl was learning to survive, but she was also learning to sacrifice. No child should have to think about sharing food so their mother wouldn't starve. The sun climbed higher, but the cold stayed. They kept walking, hoping to find kindness somewhere. At a street corner, a woman walked out of a coffee shop with a warm drink and a bag of food. Victoria gathered her courage and spoke up. Excuse me, ma'am, I don't mean to bother you, but the woman's face changed. She pulled her purse close, stepping back. I don't have any cash, she said quickly, then hurried away, as if poverty was something she could catch like a disease. Victoria barely had time to react before Clara's small voice spoke up. Mommy wasn't asking for money. The woman hesitated for a second, then turned and walked away. Victoria's face burned, not with shame, but with anger. She squeezed Clara's hand and kept moving. They had no time for cruelty. As night came, the streets became even more unforgiving. They found no more food. Victoria felt heavier with every step. Exhaustion pulled at her body. She spotted an old bench and sat down, pulling Clara close to protect her from the wind. Tomorrow will be better, Victoria whispered, but the words felt like dust in her mouth. How many times had she said them? How many times had she believed them? As she held Clara close, fighting the cold, the hunger, and the fear, she knew one thing. She was running out of tomorrows. Then she saw it. A mansion. It stood tall and proud, glowing in the darkness. It was a house for the rich, a house where people had never felt the pain of hunger or the cold of the streets. But Victoria had no choice. She had to try. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the heavy doors. The door opened, and an older man stood there looking down at them with sharp eyes. His face was serious. Victoria's heart raced. Sir, please, she whispered. It's freezing. My daughter, she can't. We have nowhere else to go. The man, Edward Blackwood, stared at them for a long moment. Then he sighed and stepped aside. One night, he said, relief washed over Victoria so strongly she almost fell. She didn't ask questions. She stepped inside with Clara, and for the first time in months, she felt warm. Victoria took a deep breath. She watched her daughter's face change from looking very tired to looking excited and happy. She wanted to tell her not to get used to this nice place. The fire made crackling sounds in the quiet room. Victoria held her small, fancy cup tightly. This didn't feel right. They were not supposed to be here. For a long time, they had slept on cold sidewalks, under bridges, and on benches where the wind was like a wild animal trying to push them away. Now they were inside a big house where the air was warm and the smell of wood and leather filled the space. It felt like a completely different world, a dangerous world. It made her want to believe in things she had given up on. Comfort, safety, and a home. Victoria stayed alert. She looked at the large wooden doors leading to the hallway. She didn't trust this kindness. The man who owned this house, Edward Blackwood, could change his mind at any time. And then the warmth would be gone and they would be back outside in the cold. She let out a short breath, telling herself not to relax. They only had one night here. That was it. Tomorrow, they would be back where they belonged. But Clara, her little girl, did not think the same way. She moved closer to the edge of the soft couch, her eyes big with wonder as she stared at the shining chandelier above them. Mommy, look at the lights! They sparkle! Clara's voice was small and full of happiness, something Victoria had not heard in a long time. Victoria's heart ached. She hated that this made her happy. The past few months had taken so much from Clara, her warmth, her laughter, the happy lights. But now, in this big house that was not theirs, Clara looked happy again. That was dangerous. Victoria reached out and held her daughter's hand, giving it a little squeeze. Don't get too comfortable, sweetheart, she whispered. Clara looked up at her, confused. But we're safe here, right? Victoria didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Before she could think, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Victoria sat up straight, her body tense. She turned her head and saw Edward Blackwood enter the room. His face was hard to read. His posture was stiff, like before. He had changed into a thick sweater, but even that didn't make him look softer. He was still strong and serious. He stopped near the fireplace and stared at them for a moment. Then he finally spoke. "There is a guest room upstairs," he said. His voice was sharp and short, like it was hard for him to say these words. "You can stay there for the night." Victoria's throat felt tight. She wasn't sure if she should trust this. Letting them sit inside for warmth was one thing, but offering them a bed was something more. "Sir, I don't," she started to say. Edward cut her off with a look. "One night," he repeated. His voice left no room for argument. Victoria slowly nodded. She wouldn't refuse, not when Clara needed this so much. Edward turned to leave, but before he could walk away, Clara spoke up. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. Her little voice carried across the room. Edward stopped. He looked at the child, and for a second, something changed in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, he looked serious again. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Victoria and Clara alone once more. The air in the room still felt tense, but Clara didn't notice. She let out a happy sigh and curled into the soft couch, her eyes slowly closing. Victoria watched her daughter sleep, her heart filled with feelings she didn't understand. "We don't belong here," she whispered to herself. The words tasted bitter, but she knew they were true. No matter how warm this place was, no matter how kind Edward had been, they were not part of this world. The next morning, the golden sunlight slipped through the thick curtains, filling the room with a soft glow. Victoria woke up before Clara. Her body still felt sore, even after sleeping in a real bed. For the first time in months, she had slept without waking up in fear of being told to leave. But even this peace felt strange. It wasn't hers to keep. She sat up and looked at Clara, who was still wrapped in the thick blankets, sleeping peacefully. Victoria reached out and gently brushed a curl from her daughter's face. A sharp pain filled her chest. Clara deserved warmth, a home, a place where she was safe. But they had no home waiting for them. And this house, no matter how grand, was not their home. A soft knock at the door made Victoria jump. Before she could move, the door creaked open. Edward Blackwood stood there, dressed neatly in dark clothes. He looked just as strong as before. His face was serious, but his sharp eyes took in the scene. The woman sitting tensely on the bed, the sleeping child, the way Victoria straightened her back as if preparing for something bad. "There's coffee downstairs," he said in a calm voice. "And food." Victoria hesitated, then nodded. She had no choice but to accept. She carefully got up, slipped on her old shoes, and picked up Clara. The girl whimpered in her sleep, but rested her head on her mother's shoulder, too used to moving from place to complain. Edward watched them quietly before turning and walking away, expecting her to follow. The house looked even bigger in the daylight. The halls stretched far, lined with paintings Victoria didn't dare look at for too long. The air smelled like fresh coffee and something buttery. The smell made her stomach twist with hunger. Edward led them to a large dining room. A table was filled with food. Toast, eggs, fruit, and a steaming pot of coffee. It was more than Victoria and Clara had seen in months. She hesitated for just a second before setting Clara down on one of the tall chairs and sitting beside her. Edward poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from them. "Eat," he said simply. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She cut a piece of toast for Clara, who grabbed it quickly, holding it tightly as if it might disappear. Victoria forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body wanted to eat everything fast. Edward watched them for a long time before speaking. "How long have you been on the streets?" His voice wasn't mean, but it was serious. He wanted the truth. Victoria looked up at him, then back down at her plate. "A while," she said softly. "That's not an answer." Victoria sat up straighter but kept her voice calm. "It's the only one I have." Edward sighed and set down his cup. "I don't usually let strangers into my house," he said, "especially people who don't explain why they are here." Victoria met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't ask to be here," she said quietly, "but my daughter needed warmth, and you opened the door." Edward studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I did," he admitted, "and I suppose I have to live with that decision." Clara, unaware of the tension between the adults, finished her toast and looked up at Edward. "Are you a king?" she asked curiously. Edward blinked, surprised. "A king?" Clara nodded. "This house looks like a castle, and you look like a king." For the first time, Edward let out a small laugh. It was short, but real. "No," he said simply. "Just a man with a house too big for one person." Victoria glanced at him, surprised by this small moment of warmth. But just as quickly, his serious look returned. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain why she was standing in the house of the man who once said he loved her? The man who broke her heart into tiny pieces. Nicholas took a shaky step forward, his eyes looking deep into hers. He looked confused, but there was something else in his eyes, something he didn't understand yet. He took a deep breath, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then his eyes moved to the small girl holding Victoria's hand. The little girl had dark curly hair and big brown eyes full of curiosity. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. His breath caught in his throat. A thought came into his mind, a thought so big that he couldn't understand it in that moment. Victoria saw the change in his face. She quickly stepped in front of the little girl, as if protecting her. "Don't," Victoria said in a quiet, shaky voice. "Please, just don't." The sound of heels clicking on the floor broke the silence. Beatrice walked toward them, her sharp eyes moving between Nicholas and Victoria. For a second, something flashed in Beatrice's eyes, something like recognition. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice cold and firm. But Victoria didn't look at Beatrice. Her attention was locked on Nicholas, watching the emotions cross his face. Shock, disbelief, and something close to anger. "I didn't know," Nicholas finally said. His voice was barely a whisper. He shook his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. "I didn't know you were." He stopped and swallowed hard. "Why are you here?" Victoria took a shaky breath, holding the little girl's hand tighter. There were too many answers to that question, and she didn't want to say any of them. Instead, she made her voice firm, strong. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "We're leaving." Nicholas's jaw tightened, his eyes dark. "No, you're not." His voice was full of certainty, and something inside Victoria snapped. She lifted her chin, her hands curling into fists. "This isn't your choice," she said. Nicholas took another step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "The moment you walked into this house, Victoria, you made it my choice." The weight of his words filled the room, heavy like a stone. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, sensing something she didn't like. "Nicholas," she warned, her voice sharp. But Nicholas didn't even look at her. His whole world had just turned upside down, and the only thing keeping him standing was the woman in front of him. The woman he had loved. The woman he had lost. The woman who was now in his house with a little girl who looked too much like him for it to be a coincidence. Victoria took a step back, breathing carefully. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly. "We just needed a place to stay for the night, and now we're leaving." Nicholas's eyes flickered to the little girl. The question was written all over his face. Victoria saw it, but she ignored it, because the truth was too dangerous, because the past was too painful, because some things, once broken, could never be fixed. She turned toward the door, pulling the little girl with her, but before she could open it, Nicholas spoke again. "You're not leaving." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The little girl looked up at her, confused. And in that moment, Victoria knew this was far from over. The room was silent, heavy, filled with emotions too big to explain. Nicholas stood still, his breath shallow, his hands clenched into fists. He stared at Victoria, waiting for answers. His heart pounded. She was here, in his house, after all these years, after all the pain. But she wasn't alone, and that changed everything. "What are you doing here, Victoria?" Nicholas finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. Victoria flinched, but not in fear, in defiance. She lifted her chin, preparing for a fight she could not escape. "It's not what you think," she said. Nicholas let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. He ran a hand through his messy hair. "Oh, really?" he said. "Because I think that you, the woman I loved," he hesitated, then continued, "the woman who disappeared without a trace, is now standing in my house with a child. A child, Victoria." Before Victoria could answer, a small voice cut through the heavy silence. "Mommy?" The little girl rubbed her sleepy eyes, stepping into the doorway. The moment she entered the room, everything changed. Nicholas's breath caught. His body went stiff. His eyes widened. He looked at the little girl, at her curls, her small frame. But it was the eyes that froze him. The deep brown eyes. The exact same eyes that had stared back at him in the mirror his whole life. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The ground beneath him seemed to vanish. "Who?" His voice barely worked. "Who is she?" Victoria's heart raced. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. What could she say? That this was his daughter? That the little girl had existed all this time without him knowing? That she had tried so hard to tell him, only for her words to be silenced before they could reach him? Nicholas took a slow step forward, never looking away from the girl. His face was a storm of emotions: shock, anger, pain. The little girl clung to Victoria's dress, her small fingers gripping tightly. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice filled with worry. Victoria knelt down, cupping her daughter's face. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything's okay." But Nicholas wasn't listening. His whole world was spinning. Victoria had left him, and now she had come back, with a little girl who had his eyes. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "Victoria," he said, his gaze burning into hers, "tell me the truth." Victoria's breath hitched. "Is she mine?" The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Victoria's heart pounded. She had no way out, no more hiding. She opened her mouth, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nicholas," but before she could finish, before she could say the truth he already knew in his heart, he exhaled sharply. He shook his head. "She is," he said, his voice breaking. Victoria took a step forward, her eyes filled with years of sadness, betrayal, and pain. "I wrote to you, Nicholas," she said, her voice shaking. "Again and again I begged you to answer me. I told you about our child." Her words hit Nicholas like heavy punches. Each one broke apart everything he had believed. His world was crumbling into sharp, painful pieces. "That's not possible," he whispered, shaking his head. "I never got any letters." Beatrice, his mother, let out a slow breath as if she had been expecting this moment. A small, cold smile appeared on her lips. "That's because there were no letters," she said, sounding amused, as if Victoria's pain didn't matter. "She's lying, Nicholas. That's what women like her do." Victoria clenched her fists, her body shaking with anger. How could Beatrice be so cruel? "You don't get to stand there and act like you know everything," Victoria snapped. "You have no idea what I went through." Beatrice tilted her head, pretending to be curious. "Don't I?" she said softly. "A woman like you suddenly shows up, claiming to have a child. His child? How very convenient." Her eyes moved toward Isabel, the little girl standing beside Victoria. For the first time, Beatrice's cold mask slipped. Her eyes weren't filled with love or concern. No, it was something else. She was thinking, planning. Victoria felt something fierce rise inside her, something protective. "Don't you dare look at her like that," she warned, stepping in front of Isabel. "You have no right. You lost that right before she was even born." Nicholas's head was spinning. None of this made sense. Victoria had written to him. She had told him about their daughter. Then why had he never known? His mother's calm voice cut through his storm of thoughts. "Nicholas," she said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "Don't let emotions cloud your judgment. This woman left you years ago, and now she suddenly expects you to believe that you have a child together? A child she never mentioned until now?" Nicholas's body was tense with anger. "I never got the letters," he muttered, almost to himself. Victoria let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you didn't," she said, her voice sharp, "because she made sure of it." She turned to Beatrice, her eyes blazing. "Didn't you?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow, completely calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly. "You should be careful, dear. Throwing around false accusations won't help you." Victoria took a step closer, her whole body shaking with rage. "You burned them, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice like ice. "You destroyed every single letter before he ever had a chance to read them." Beatrice didn't even flinch. "You're being dramatic." Nicholas turned to his mother sharply, his heart pounding. "Is it true?" he demanded. Beatrice's face stayed calm, but something flickered in her eyes, something unreadable. Something that looked a little too much like satisfaction. "Darling," she sighed, "you were meant for greater things. I wasn't going to let some girl ruin that." The world seemed to stop. The truth was there, hanging in the air, impossible to ignore. Nicholas felt like the air had been knocked out of him. His mother had known. She had stolen his choice away from him. The letters, the truth. His daughter. He turned to Victoria, his stomach twisting at the pain in her eyes. "I never knew," he said, his voice raw with emotion. It was the truth. A painful, terrible truth. Victoria swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. "And now you do." The words were simple, but the weight they carried was huge. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what happened next. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas had no idea what to do. Nicholas stood frozen, his mind spinning. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely think. This couldn't be true. His mother wouldn't do something like this. Would she? "You expect me to believe this?" he asked, his voice low and angry. "You want me to believe that you wrote to me for years, that you tried to tell me about her?" He glanced at Isabel, who held onto Victoria's coat, her small fingers gripping tightly. His eyes returned to Victoria, his face unreadable. "And not one letter ever reached me? Not even one?" Victoria met his eyes without looking away. "Not one," she said firmly, "because your mother made sure of it." Nicholas let out a sharp breath and shook his head. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "My mother wouldn't." He stopped, but even as he tried to deny it, doubt was creeping into his heart. Victoria saw it. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Are you absolutely sure? Because I'm not." The room was silent. Then Edward Blackwood, Nicholas's father, who had been watching everything quietly, finally spoke. "Nicholas," he said, his voice steady, "think." Nicholas turned to his father, frustrated. "Think what?" he demanded. "That my mother, the woman who raised me, stole letters that Victoria wrote to me?" Edward studied him carefully. "Is it really so hard to believe?" he asked. Nicholas turned back to Victoria, his voice colder now, trying to keep control. "If this is true," he said, "then prove it." Victoria took a slow breath, then reached into her coat pocket. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out a small old envelope. She stepped forward and held it out. Nicholas hesitated before taking it. His fingers brushed against hers for just a moment. His heart pounded as he looked at the envelope. His name was written on it in familiar, delicate handwriting. He recognized it immediately. It was her handwriting. Carefully, he pulled the letter from the envelope. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Each one cut into his heart like a knife. "Dear Nicholas, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you care, but I have to try. I have to believe that the man I loved, the man who swore he loved me, deserves to know the truth. I'm pregnant, Nicholas, and I'm scared. I don't know what to do. But if there's even the smallest chance that you still care, Please, please don't leave me alone in this." Nicholas gripped the letter tightly, his chest aching. He read it again and again, hoping the words would change, hoping for some explanation that would make it hurt less. He looked up at Victoria, his voice barely a whisper. "I never saw this." Victoria's face was unreadable, but her eyes shone with sadness. "I know," she said, "because I stopped writing when I realized you were never coming." His jaw got tight, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was angry, so angry, but he stayed calm. He took a step forward, his shoes making a loud sound on the shiny floor. The sound made Beatrice, who was standing by the fireplace holding her phone, freeze. She hadn't noticed him yet. She didn't know that he had heard everything she had just said. Then she turned around and saw him. Something changed in her eyes. Not fear, because Beatrice Blackwood was never afraid, but she knew she had been caught. "Nicholas," she said in a smooth voice, putting her phone into the pocket of her fancy silk robe. She stood up straight like nothing had happened. "I thought you were still away." She spoke quickly, but Nicholas could see it now. The little cracks in the perfect way she acted, the way she was trying to stay in control. "You heard me, didn't you?" she asked. Her voice had no sadness, no guilt, just a little bit of annoyance. Nicholas took a deep breath, his face unreadable. "I did." Beatrice watched him for a moment, then let out a sigh and walked over to the small table in the corner where she kept drinks. She poured herself a glass of dark-colored scotch, her hands steady as ever. She swirled the drink in the glass before taking a sip. Then, turning to face him, she asked, "And what do you think you heard?" She smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. "That I burned some letters? That I stepped in to fix something that needed fixing?" Her voice was so calm, like she was just talking about a small business decision. "Nicholas, you were young, too young. That girl, Victoria, she would have ruined you." Her calmness made Nicholas even angrier. He took a step closer, his whole body stiff with anger. "You took my family from me," he said, his voice sharp and cold. Beatrice raised an eyebrow like she wasn't impressed. "Family?" she repeated, almost laughing. "Nicholas, please, you were just a boy. You didn't have a family, you had a mistake, and I did what any loving mother would do. I fixed it." Nicholas breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling. "A mistake?" he said, his voice quiet but dangerous. "You mean Victoria? You mean Clara, my daughter?" The word felt heavy when he said it. He had lost so much time. Beatrice didn't react. "I mean the life you would have had if I hadn't stepped in," she said, as if she was stating a fact. "You were meant for greater things, Nicholas. Power, success, a future that mattered, and you would have thrown it all away for some poor girl and a child born outside of marriage." Her words hit him like a punch. He had always known his mother was strict, even harsh, but this was something else. She truly believed she had saved him. Nicholas let out a bitter laugh. "So, you decided for me?" he said. "You sat here in this house, playing games with my life, and chose to take them from me?" His voice shook. "For years, I hated her. I thought Victoria left me. I thought she didn't want me. And all this time, it was you." Beatrice sighed and put down her glass. "Nicholas," she said softly, almost like a mother again, "you were too young to understand. I did what needed to be done." She reached out, trying to touch his arm, to bring him back to her side. "And look at you now. You are everything I wanted you to be." But Nicholas pulled away, stepping back as if her touch would burn him. "You don't get to take credit for the man I became," he said, his voice full of quiet anger. "You don't get to pretend you did this out of love." His hands curled into fists again. "You didn't save me, Mother. You destroyed me." For the first time, something in Beatrice's face changed, a flicker of emotion. But it was gone as fast as it came. She stood tall again, her face cold. "I won't apologize for protecting my son," she said. "And one day when you calm down, you'll see that I was right." Nicholas took a long, shaky breath. He had always known his mother controlled things, but he had never thought she would betray him like this. He stared at her, memorizing her face, the face of the woman who stole his family, his choices, his past. And then, with quiet finality, he said words he never thought he would say. I don't need you anymore. Beatrice's lips parted slightly, a flicker of surprise on her face. But Nicholas didn't stay to watch her reaction. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the large, empty house, a house that had never truly been a home. He didn't stop walking until he reached the front door. Victoria and Clara were waiting for him on the other side. Nicholas sat on the edge of the grand sitting room, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers curled into the fabric of his pants. The house was huge, but it felt small now, like it was closing in on him. So much had happened in one day. So many truths had come out, crashing down on him like a giant wave, leaving him lost. But nothing was more overwhelming than the little girl sitting across from him. Her feet didn't touch the floor, and she swung them back and forth. Clara, his daughter. A thought so big, so impossible that it felt like a weight on his chest. He didn't know how to do this, how to fix the years that had been stolen, how to make up for not knowing she existed. He had spent years controlling things, running businesses, making huge deals, but nothing had prepared him for this. Clara, unaware of all the emotions in the room, sat happily. She didn't know about the pain, the lies, the anger surrounding her. She just looked at him with big brown eyes, full of curiosity. The firelight made her dark curls glow, and Nicholas felt his throat tighten. She looked so much like him. But she also looked like Victoria, the shape of her face, the little determined lift of her chin, the way her small hands curled into the hem of her dress when she was nervous. Just like Victoria used to. You have a big house, Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was small, soft, but it made something deep in Nicholas's chest hurt. He cleared his throat. I do. He paused. Do you like it? She shrugged, thinking about it. It's nice, she said, but it's too quiet. Nicholas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Too quiet. He had never thought of it that way. But she was right. The Blackwood estate had always been a place full of fancy things, but empty of warmth. She should have grown up here, he thought. She should have had a home. He swallowed hard, not sure what to say next. Where do you and your mother live? He asked gently, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Clara's face lit up with excitement. Lots of places, she said happily. Sometimes we stay in shelters, sometimes we sleep outside. Mommy says we're like explorers. Her voice was full of excitement, but Nicholas's stomach twisted. She had spent her whole life without a home. His daughter. His own flesh and blood. He felt sick. He felt guilty. He should have been there. He should have known. He should have found them. Victoria, who had been standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, watched him with unreadable eyes. As Stone finally spoke, her voice was sharp like a knife. She doesn't need you, she said, cutting through the thick silence. Nicholas turned quickly to look at her. Her eyes were cold, like ice. There was no kindness, only a strong wall she had built over many years. Years of being alone. Years of surviving without him. That's not what this is, Nicholas said, his voice rough and tired. Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was short and bitter. Isn't it? She asked. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. You think sitting here, feeling sorry for a few minutes, is going to fix everything? You think that will erase all the years we spent alone? Nicholas took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to get angry. I didn't know, he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't know. Victoria's jaw tightened. And what difference does that make? She asked, her voice quieter but still sharp. She doesn't know you. She doesn't need you. Those words hit Nicholas like a punch to the stomach. He expected Victoria to be upset. He knew she wouldn't just let him back into their lives. But hearing it so clearly, so coldly, still hurt more than he thought it would. Before he could say anything, a small giggle broke the silence. You look like the prince in Mommy's stories, Clara said, her tiny voice full of happiness. Both adults turned to look at her, surprised. Nicholas blinked, not sure what to say. What? Clara smiled, swinging her legs on the chair. Mommy tells me bedtime stories. The prince is always tall and serious, just like you. Victoria sighed, rubbing her face. Clara? She said softly, but Clara wasn't finished. The prince is always a little sad too, she added, tilting her head as she studied him. Like you. Nicholas's throat felt tight. A wave of feelings crashed over him. He didn't know what to say. This little girl didn't know his past. She didn't know everything that had been taken from him. And yet, somehow, she understood. Victoria stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. It's late, sweetheart, she whispered. Time for bed. Clara yawned and nodded, sliding off the chair to take her mother's hand. But before she walked away, she turned back to Nicholas, her big brown eyes full of something innocent and pure. Good night, Mr. Prince. Her words were simple, but they broke something inside him. He had missed everything. Every bedtime story. Every night she had fallen asleep without knowing he even existed. As Victoria led Clara out of the room, Nicholas sat there, his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. He had spent years chasing success, chasing power, chasing the life he thought he wanted. And all that time, the most important thing had been out there, alone, without him. His daughter, his family. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas Blackwood realized that everything he had built meant nothing if he couldn't have them. Victoria stood by the window of the Grand looking out at the huge gardens of the Blackwood estate. The moon made everything glow silver, and soft golden lights lit the paths below. It was beautiful, too perfect, too different from the life she had lived. She had spent too many nights on cold streets, in shelters full of sadness, in places where safety was just a dream. This mansion, with its silk curtains and fancy furniture, was not her world. It never had been. It never would be. This is not our home, she thought. It never will be. Behind her, Clara slept peacefully in the giant bed, her tiny hands gripping the blanket. She looked safe, comfortable, happy. Victoria's heart ached. Her daughter had never known a bed like this. She had never fallen asleep without fear. A part of Victoria wanted to let her stay, to let her have this one nice thing. But another part, the stronger part, knew they couldn't. Staying meant danger. Staying meant opening wounds she had tried so hard to heal. Staying meant trusting a man who had already left her once before. A knock on the door made her jump. She already knew who it was. When she opened the door, Edward Blackwood stood there. His face was calm, but his eyes understood more than he said. He was dressed in a dark robe, looking as elegant as always. But tonight he seemed different, tired, like a man who had seen too much. You're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question, it was a fact. Victoria swallowed hard, gripping the door. Yes. Edward looked at her for a long time, then he stepped inside and closed the door softly. He glanced at Clara sleeping, and for a moment his face softened. Then he turned back to Victoria. And what happens next? He asked. You go back to the streets, to shelters, to sleeping wherever you can find a place? His voice wasn't unkind, but it carried a quiet challenge. We'll manage, Victoria said, crossing her arms. But even she heard how unsure she sounded. Edward sighed. Victoria, you have to think about what's best for her. Victoria's body tensed. I am thinking about her, she snapped. I've thought about nothing but her since the day she was born. Edward didn't argue. He just watched her, letting her own words settle in. Then he said, Then why are you running? For a moment, Victoria couldn't breathe. Edward kept going. I know you're scared, and you have every right to be. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is about that little girl in that bed. And whether you like it or not, she deserves to know her father. Victoria looked away, pressing a hand to her forehead. You think I don't know that? She whispered. You think I haven't spent every second wondering if I'm doing the right thing? She swallowed hard. But I won't let her grow up waiting for a father who might leave again. I won't let her spend her life wondering if she's enough. Edward sighed and stepped toward the door. You're right, he said. You can't control what Nicholas does, but you can control what Clara knows. He glanced at the sleeping child. She will ask questions one day, and when she does, what will you tell her? Victoria felt her heart tighten. Was she protecting Clara, or was she protecting herself? Edward opened the door. Just think about it, he said, because once you leave, there's no coming back. You ungrateful boy, Beatrice said angrily, standing up quickly. Do you even know how much I have done for you? All the sacrifices I made to make sure you were successful? Nicholas looked at her, calm and quiet. Did you ever think that maybe I never wanted this success? That maybe all I wanted was to live a life I chose for myself? The room was silent. The silence was heavy, filled with all the words they had never said, all the feelings they had hidden for years. Nicholas took a deep breath, ready to say what he had been holding inside for so long. I'm leaving, he said. I'm done. I'm cutting ties with you, with the company, with everything you used to control me. Beatrice's face turned pale. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Nicholas continued, I will make sure everyone knows what you did, that you controlled my life, that you took my family away from me, and I will make sure you never have any power over me again. He didn't wait for her to reply. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, shocked and speechless. When he reached the front of the house, Victoria was already waiting. She had a bag over her shoulder, and little Clara was holding her hand tightly. Victoria looked up at Nicholas, unsure, ready for another disappointment. Nicholas met her gaze. This time he was sure. He spoke with confidence. I won't let them take you from me again. His voice was steady. It was a promise. Victoria looked at him carefully, searching for doubt. She expected him to change his mind, but she found none. For the first time, she started to believe him. Victoria stood at the edge of the Blackwood estate. The wind whispered through the trees. The night sky stretched above them, the stars twinkling like tiny broken pieces of a dream she once had. She had always thought love was fragile, something that could be taken away easily, something that could be destroyed. But here she was, standing on the edge of something new, something scary, but something real. She looked at Nicholas. He stood beside her, his hands deep in his pockets, looking far ahead. He had been quiet for a while, giving her time to think. It was strange to see him like this. He wasn't the Nicholas she had known before, the rich, untouchable heir to a big company. Now he was just a man, free from his mother's control, free from a life he had never truly wanted. She took a deep breath and tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to stop running. Nicholas turned to her, his blue eyes calm and patient. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, he said gently, or tomorrow, or even next week. I just need to know. Is there a chance? Can you trust me enough to try? His words floated in the cold night air, surrounding her like a quiet question. For years she had believed she was alone, that no one would stand by her, that she had to protect Clara by keeping their world small. But now she wondered, had she been protecting her daughter, or had she just been protecting herself? She looked at Clara. The little girl sat a few feet away, humming a tune, playing with a tiny flower she had picked. She had no idea how important this moment was. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe in her innocence, Clara had already found what Victoria had been too afraid to believe in, a father who truly wanted to be there. Victoria whispered, She likes you. Nicholas smiled softly. She's amazing, he said. I don't deserve her, but I want to try. I want to be the father she deserves. Victoria felt something break inside her, something she had locked away for a long time. Years of anger, loneliness, and sadness sat heavy in her chest. For the first time, she didn't want to carry it anymore. She had spent so long seeing Nicholas as the man he used to be, the man who had made mistakes, the man who had left. But he was here now. He had fought for them. Not because it was easy, not because it was convenient, but because he truly didn't want to lose them again. And wasn't that worth something? Wasn't that worth at least a chance? She turned to face him fully, searching for any sign that he might change his mind. But there was none. He was determined. He meant every word. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for his hand. His hand was warm, solid. The touch sent a shiver through her, but not from fear. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe, she said, her voice uncertain but not afraid anymore. She swallowed hard, looking up at him. Maybe we could try. Nicholas took a sharp breath, as if he had been waiting forever to hear those words. His fingers curled around hers, firm but gentle, as if afraid she might pull away. Are you sure? He asked, his voice quiet. Victoria let out a shaky breath. She nodded. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. I don't know how to do this, but I don't want to be afraid anymore. Nicholas squeezed her hand slightly. He smiled, a small, almost disbelieving smile. Then we figure it out, he said, together. The word warmed her. It was something new, something terrifying, but something she was finally ready to believe in. The morning sun shone through the grand windows of the Blackwood estate, spreading golden light across the marble floors. The house, which once felt like a cage to Nicholas, now felt different, warmer, alive in a way it had never been before. The silence that had once filled the house was gone. Now laughter filled the air, soft and happy. Nicholas put down his coffee and walked to the window. He saw Clara running through the garden, her curls bouncing with each step. Victoria sat nearby, watching her daughter with a smile. The morning sunlight made her look even more beautiful. He still couldn't believe it. They were here. They had stayed. Not because they had to, not because they had no choice, but because they wanted to. Nicholas had grown up believing that love was a weakness, that having feelings made a man vulnerable. That was what his mother had taught him. She had told him that power and control were the only things that mattered. But now he saw the truth. It wasn't power or money that mattered. It was this. It was them. Nicholas stepped outside. The cool morning air touched his face as he walked toward the garden. Clara saw him, and her face lit up. "Daddy!" she called, leaving her flower behind and running toward him. Every time she called him that, it still felt unreal. But it was real, and it was his. She jumped into his arms. Giggling, he held her close. "Daddy, can we stay?" she asked. Her question was simple, full of hope, but to Nicholas it meant everything. He looked at Victoria. There was no fear in her eyes this time, no walls, no doubt. She nodded, smiling softly. "We're already home," she said. The words settled between them, final and true. Nicholas took a slow breath, letting go of his past, of his pain, of the man he used to be. He wasn't that man anymore. He had been trapped for years, following a path that was never really his. But now, with Clara in his arms and Victoria beside him, he knew. This was the life he wanted. This was the life he chose. Victoria stepped closer, gently touching Clara's back, before letting her hand rest on Nicholas's. For the first time in years, they were truly home. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.